Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Patricia Owens. Patricia is a professor of international relations at the University of Oxford, and she's the author of Erased, A History of International Thought Without Men, a book that was recently published by Princeton University Press. I'm very excited of being here with Patricia. Patricia, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast, Javier.
Thanks for being here. Let me start with a question that hopefully is going to help us connect your life and your career with your book. Your book focuses on a cohort of leaders of international relations in the early 20th century that faced a bunch of challenges that eventually were erased from the history of international relations as we frequently frame it. And I would like to hear about your personal path as a scholar, how you ended up becoming the scholar that you are today, and what type of challenges you face as a woman, and how they might be a certain type of legacy of the challenges that the cohort that are the center of your book face. Tell me about your career and this role of being a woman in this field that might have a bunch of gender biases, please.
Yeah, that's a good question. My academic journey was incredibly smooth, right, compared to these, women who were working in the early to long mid-20th century. And the book sort of goes up to the 1980s. Just to say that the book isn't quite a study of the challenges that these women faced in academia, but more a sort of gendered history of an intellectual field. That story was, of course, profoundly shaped by misogyny, and I'm telling a story of sort of presence and then erasure. So the book is concerned with a wider picture. That said, over 20 years ago, when I started in academia, I feel that this was a sort of very incredibly lucky moment that is both different to what preceded and then different to what followed. So, there was no kind of sense of there being a crisis in the academic job market when I was coming through. And for many, many years, I didn't think that I had experienced much kind of sexism in the academy. And there were moments and there were sort of things that I was perhaps quite naive, and I sort of was just very lucky with sort of placement and supervisors and getting jobs and publications. And I felt like there was this moment of progress. So this is in the 90s and early 2000s, and then things changed. So anybody who's now in their sort of late 40s and early 50s, I think, certainly in the British context, I think also to some extent in the US context as well, there were jobs. And the field was broadening. It was the sort of end of the Cold War, and there was a sort of intellectual pluralism and opening within IR. I didn't face the kind of explicit gender and class hierarchies in terms of access to higher education and research. I hope. I don't know in the way in which my work has been read and received, of course. Nobody threatened to throw me down a flight of stairs or push me out of an academic job for having too many children, or mental health crises, these are stories that I tell it in the book. And as far as I know, again, I've not received a job because I was a woman, or written out of history of my own department, as far as I'm aware. These are again things that happen in the book and that I think haven't happened to me. But of course, anyone who's thinking about the contemporary academy is aware of the gender pay gap. There's sexual harassment and bullying. Women are asked to do more kind of university housekeeping work, especially women of color. I think, again, I've been lucky enough to mostly dodge some of the worst of all of that. So I think I would just say in general that the fate of women in the academies really varies by race, class, nationality, disability, sexuality, contract, right? The sort of precarious contracts that are now all over the academy. And I've never really had to suffer the fate of many in precarious contracts. So again, I feel quite privileged in my intellectual journey, and I'm very aware that those who came before me and those who come after have really struggled.
Let's get into that cohort that you study in the book and the very beginning of it. And this is something that surprised me a bit. The way in which you describe the emergence of IR and the British context in the early 20th century is one in which women had a crucial role that was fairly well recognized, and their influence was salient back in that moment. I'm curious about what allowed this to happen, right? Considering that the society was not particularly open and friendly towards women in roles of leadership, right? So what were the features of that context that allow for women to have a salient voice in that conversation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a similar story to the history of sociology. So in the early 20th century, we're talking about a new field. So international relations as a sort of subject doesn't really enter universities until the late 19th, early 20th century, really. And the sort of wider global context for this is the closing of imperial frontiers, the idea that the world had to be managed as a whole, and that this language of international relations sort of you were used to capture that. And in the interwar period, the sort of League of Nations moment also coincides. So the birth of this field, major global transformations coincide with the entrance of women into higher education, with the international women's suffrage movement, with increasing politicization of the workers, of anti-colonial nationalists, and there's this sort of political and global ferment. And because the early field, returning back into the academy, had no single home in one university department, it lacks some of the more entrenched patriarchal networks of the older disciplines. So, for example, Oxford's first woman professor, Agnes Hedler Morley, and its first African-American graduate student, Merce Tate, were both scholars of international relations. Right? So was the first woman professor at Edinburgh, Elizabeth Wiskman. The first IR course at Cambridge, which ran for nearly 20 years, was taught by Gladys Jones, a woman who was an historian. So intellectually, the field was quite eclectic. In the early 20th century, unlike in the United States, where it was really sort of conceived of as within the context of political science, international relations in Britain was dominated by historians and classicists. And so, women historians and classicists, or women historians in particular, but also some classicists, entered the field in this sort of internationalist moment, and that was sort of understood as, in many ways, aligned with wider sort of sociological changes in terms of women's role.
When do things start to change, right? So the big story is going to be about the erasure of the role of these women. You suggest that the 1950s seems to maybe be that turning point. What happens then during that period, right? What were the things that were changing in the field that allowed that to become the dominant trend?
Yeah, I think a good question. I think that there were two major things that happened in the 1950s. The first, as it relates to attempts to establish international relations as a separate university subject in the British context. So this was led, again, so moving from a kind of interdisciplinary field in which lawyers, classicists, historians, political scientists, anthropologists, geographers were all writing about international relations and understood themselves to be thinking about international relations in different departments. And sometimes in departments of international politics or international studies, there's a move away from this, pushed by two men, powerful international relations professors in London who were trained as lawyers. One was Charles Manning, who was the Montagu Professor of International Relations at the LSE for 30 years, from 1932, and then George Schwarzenberger, a German kind of realist, Britain's answer to Hans Morgenthau at the University College London. And they wanted to stop IR from being absorbed into political science, but they also wanted to undermine historians' hegemony in the field. The historians were very doubtful of the need for a sort of separate subject, because this could only lead to sort of dilettantism or absorption into political science and all the problems of that field. So the solution proposed by Charles Manning and followed by Schwarzenberger was to define IR not by method, but by subject, by theoretical development, so that the sort of subject that international relations theorists would be trying to theorize and think about was the society of states, by which they meant the society of white states. So this erased empire, not instead of thinking about the structure of the international system as very, very much linked, striated by empires and imperial rivalry, they conceived of international relations in more abstractly in terms of the society of European states, to distinguish what they were doing from the historians. And in doing so, they erased, women. They erased empire, and in doing so, the many women writers on colonial administration and empire, many historians, diplomatic historians, as unable to sort of theorize the international. So there's that moment in the British context, and then in the 1950s, also, of course, a moment when American realists, anybody who knows any kind of thing about international relations will understand this sort of past hegemony of kind of realist theories of international relations. And so in the 1950s, they wanted to refound the fields in American policy science, and in that process to develop a kind of canon of intellectual greats with whom that the great realist traditions of thinking on international relations could hark back to. And they, in doing so, invented a kind of canon of all white male thinkers to legitimize their project. But we can talk a little bit more about canons in a moment. But this was also a process of erasure of the many, and of caricature of the many diverse kinds of international thinking that was happening in the interwar period that I mentioned earlier.
Tell me more about that canon. What exactly does that mean? Like, what are the features in terms of the topics that it tries to capture, but also the, I guess, sociological features of the people writing about them? Tell me about that, please.
Yeah. So, in Erased, I don't talk that much about the canon. It's a sort of theme that kind of, it's a sort of minor theme in the book, but in the wider project within which that book sits, this project called the Leave the Hume Project on Women in the History of International Thought, which I co-led with Kim Hutchings and Katerina Rietzler, an historian, we do examine the question of the canon. And so here I'll mention some work I've done with Kim Hutchings, my co-author on an article in American Political Science Review. And, we are, asking, well, first of all, the IR canon emerged in the mid-20th century. Again, it was defined in Anglo-American universities in this Cold War context. And what it did was allow realist thinkers to locate themselves within this kind of 2,000-year-old story in which the great thinkers understood the core IR topics that were, war, power, peace, security, not empire, not race, not colonial administration, which were the core topics of international relations in, before the 1950s. That of course defined the study of international relations in the age of empires. So we're still quite not yet in the year of decolonization. So we're still talking about the 1950s. So this is one of the reasons why this is quite remarkable. So of course, as we know from the history of in other fields, no canon is a kind of list of timeless classics, a kind of neutral list. It's a political construction, right? And it tells us it's about legitimizing. It's a legitimization project, as in this case, legitimization of a field and of a particular realist hegemony. It tells us much more about who has power in the academy than about the sort of history of international thought itself, as we might think of that as historians. And the way it's constructed, of course, is through, textbooks, through surveys of great thinkers, through syllabi, through the reproduction of that particular form of so-called canonical knowledge, through graduate students who then also teach more or less the same canon that was elevated in a very particular time and place by a very small group of white men in the U.S. court, in which no women or no people of color outside a small segment of Europe and the U.S. ever had any meaningful thoughts about international relations, which of course is ridiculous.
I want to hear more about I guess, the specific mechanisms of this erasure of women, right? So I guess one very clear is this consolidation of the canon, right? So defining what people should read and not, and what is legitimate science and not. But your book is full of very personal, detailed stories about the faith of the ideas of these women. Why don't you tell us more about that? So, what, like, the erasure of these figures took place in what ways? What were the processes specifically that ended up in some of these ideas and relevance of these figures to be forgotten?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I mean, there are several mechanisms. I mean, I've just spoken about one of them, right? Canon formation and selective memory. So an example, a concrete example there would be the sort of founding myths of the field. So one of the founding myths of the field, which has now been debunked in a quite problematic way, is the founding myth of the first debate that defined international relations in the interwar period, which was between realists and idealists. And the protagonists of this, of course, are all male. But in fact, so later IR historians have suggested, of course, this was an invention. This debate never existed. It was an invention of the realists in order to kind of caricature a sort of idealist position on the possibility of international reform. And that realists were saying, we can't be like these naive realists, the idealists in the interwar period who thought that could build international institutions that would be able to tame and domesticate great power politics. And realists know, because we can go back to Thucydides and Machiavelli and Hobbes and show that the sort of nature, the different regimes may change, but the nature of power politics between states doesn't really change. And Alfred Zimmern is the figure who kind of encapsulates the kind of idealist position in this sort of canon. Well, in fact, I think it's very difficult to think about Alfred Zimmern and his writing and his influence and any debate he had with, for example, Nicholas Speakman, one of the founding fathers of realism in IR, without thinking about Lucy Zimmern, who was the sort of one half of the kind of power couple that were the Zimmerns in interwar international relations. They co-founded the Geneva School of International Studies when Nicholas Speakman was the deputy director. He resigned because of a dispute over the way in which international relations should be taught at Geneva. And the dispute was not with Alfred, it was with Lucy Zimmern. And she was feted and celebrated and invited to give talks and wrote a lot on international relations. She was hugely influential on the kind of mode and form of teaching at the Geneva School, which was really the most influential internationalist educational project of the interwar period. And Nicholas Speakman goes and founds the Yale Center for International Studies in the US after he resigns from Geneva, precisely in opposition to what Lucy had tried to develop in Geneva, which was in many ways the caricature of the realist caricature of idealism. Right, everything that the realists were saying, Lucy was trying to sort of enact at Geneva, but she gets erased in this kind of story of the sort of history of the great debates that formed the origins of the field. So that's one mechanism: canon formation and selective memory. Another is disciplinary boundary drawing, like I mentioned earlier. The effort to develop IR as a certain kind of theoretical enterprise was one of the mechanisms of the erasure of women from the earlier history of the field. And then there are also gendered hierarchies of knowledge. So, for example, many early women internationalists, writers who were kind of eminent as scholars, also wrote popular public-facing intellectual work on international relations. They were writing for a wider audience. This was often framed as sort of propagandistic or moralistic kind of work, in contrast to what was presented as kind of more rigorous scientific scholarship, for example, done at Chatham House, which was still the leading think tank, international relations think tank in Britain, founded in 1920. Then there are like archival forms of neglect. So women's papers and correspondence are much less likely to be preserved and catalogued than men's. They're also more likely to be held in with their husbands. So in the case of Lucy Zimmern, who I just mentioned, like, she has her own papers at the University of Wales, but the vast majority of her papers actually can be found inside Alfred Zimmern's papers at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, but they are not separately catalogued. I mean, really, those should be labelled as the Alfred and Lucy Zimmern papers. And in other cases, Agnes Edel-Morley, who was very influential and was the first woman professor statutory woman professor at Oxford, and the Montagu Burton professor there for many years. Her papers, until very recently, were housed with her father's in Cambridge. So this creates gaps in historical records. Again, that sort of reinforces this impression of women's absence. But then the big one, and the one that I spend more time, or at some time, writing about in Erased, is bad disciplinary and intellectual history. So, these women were there, and they were influential. They were recognized by their peers as being part of the intellectual scene. And but then later, figures who come along, mostly, let us to say, male IR scholars writing the histories of the field, again, from perhaps the 1980s and 1990s, so after the period that I'm talking about. They are reproducing some of the erasures that some of the contemporary erasures that women faced, reproducing the all-male, all-white canon, which, of course, are not. We can historicize canons, but attempts to create a list of canonical thinkers is not the work of historians, right? This is the work of disciplinary movers and shakers, and so to then simply kind of reproduce the work of those who have been canonized is not really good historical work, or not very good intellectual disciplinary history. But that's what we had for a kind of couple of decades when the first sort of the histories of IR were being written. So these mechanisms, again, there's a combination of both, processes of which women are excluded in real time in their own contemporary context, and then also later retrospectively from the intellectual and disciplinary histories.
Let me ask you, I guess, a related question that I anticipate to be particularly difficult to answer, which is, I guess, connected to the motives of the behaviors that ended up erasing the contribution of these women, right? So, and what I have in mind or the question I have in mind is, how much of this was deliberate effort to erase this women as a gatekeeping type of mechanism or something, or instead just as an unintended consequence of collective biases. And again, I feel this is a somewhat unfair question, in the sense that it's very hard to identify motives in people's, in particular, looking at historical sources, which, by the way, I want to ask you more about sources in a bit. But how do you approach this, which is in a certain way a moral question, right? So what were the motives of the people doing the things that eventually would lead to the erasure of this women in the history of the field?
I mean, so the villain of the book is Charles Manning, and I mean, in some ways, his primary motive is the protection of his institutional power base at the LSE. I mean, to some extent, it is quite a sort of a mundane sort of form of gatekeeping in his own particular context. He's the head of a department, and he wants to protect his own fiefdom and justify why there should be a separate Department of International Studies than International Relations at LSE. And so that's part of it. I think it's also, he just wasn't trained as an historian, and he was an odd appointment. Many people were quite shocked by his appointment. He didn't seem to have that many good qualifications for the post. And he, but we have to understand Charles Manning. We also have to understand more about his biography. I mean, he was a lifelong, he was from South Africa, Oxford-trained lawyer, and he did some work at the League of Nations, which justified his position as Montagu Burton Professor of IR at LSE. And he was a lifelong supporter of apartheid in South Africa. And he, so there were women appointed to the department before he arrived, but no woman. But he never appointed another woman during his entire tenure as chair at the LSE, and married one of his own undergraduate students. So I think that we can say safely say there was a sort of, under like misogyny and kind of racism in his conduct. In terms of his motivation, I mean, I don't, I think that he thought he was trying to sort of, his project was to create a sort of separate IR, and the means in which he did that had racialized and highly gendered effects. So I think that there's clearly deliberate acts of gatekeeping he represented, in his case. But then, then there are also the entrenched collective biases that sort of give that meaning. So for me, it's not either or. So deliberate acts include, again, the redefinition of IR's boundaries in a way that privileges male networks and or his networks and methods. And then, the gendered and racialized assumption about what counts as theory and the international. Again, assumptions that get subsequently taught as neutral and sort of intellectual sociological question, but actually, can't really be understood without seeing how that was defined against, for example, the Montague Burton professor at Oxford I mentioned, Agnes Sedler-Morley. So she becomes the kind of caricature of the diplomatic historian. So they're not condemning her because she's a woman, but it is easier to claim that as a diplomatic historian, she was only interested in the sort of, the how questions and the detail, and she wasn't a sort of deep in, theoretical thinker. But of course, for her, these IR theories that they were developing were absolutely nonsense, and there wasn't anything of value in their intellectual projects. And in hindsight, of course, she was completely right. Manning's project failed, and international history, global history, deep archival studies of major transformations in world politics. Of course, this work is done by historians. It is not done by IR scholars. So, I think that it's not really an either or.
Now, so you mentioned a bit ago the role of bad intellectual history in the field as a contributor to this erasure of women. But what would it be a better type of intellectual history? And here I want you to tell me more about the way of approaching sources and what type of sources. It's very challenging what you have done, right? So try to identify something that was erased, right? So which to begin with sounds like there's not going to be much evidence out there, right? So what were the type of sources that allow you to do this? And how much of what you perceive as deficiencies in intellectual history are a result of that, right? Of people struggling to find the right type of sources. Tell me about that. Like, I guess this is a methods question. So, tackle that. I was getting you first.
Yeah. I mean, so non-appearance, meaning the sort of, women not appearing in intellectual and disciplinary histories or in the canon. This is not evidence of absence, right? This is evidence of erasure. So that means treating the erasure as a sort of, as an event, like to be documented and explained and accounted for, with actors and processes and timelines, which is what we've been talking about. So it's not quite proving a negative, but it's about documenting a historical process that left, recoverable residues in many cases, in others not. Unfortunately, there are many, figures who, the archival sources are not there. But you can, but it's possible to undertake a sort of feminist recovery history. And this is sort of in many ways what the project has done. And it's a very long-standing practice in, feminist history, women's history. So in my case, it was sort of laborious, but it wasn't difficult, so it was it was hard work, but it wasn't difficult. I mean, because we sort of already knew, so historians were saying the early 20th century was this moment in which internationalist thinking was was plural and diverse. And, we sort of had a sense that there was a little more going on, and there were some sort of names that were floated around, but there was a big disjuncture between what historians were sort of saying and what IR understood as its own history and what IR was teaching. So in my case, it was about building the empirical record from scratch, right, using primary, mostly archival sources. So in that sense, it's a kind of very quite traditional recovery history. So I wanted to identify women teaching in the academy, broadly understood, teaching international relations, and that didn't just mean in international relations departments or political science departments, but also in history departments, geography, anthropology. So taking the earliest, widest definition, the understanding of international relations as a plural field in the early 20th century meant obviously looking outside of what we might think of as its locations today. So I looked at the institutional records and lecture lists in in the main centres of what we understood as to be IR teaching in Britain. We already knew what those main centres were: Oxford, LSE, Aberystwyth, various centres in London, Manchester, Edinburgh, and elsewhere. I located more than 100 collections of papers across 20 different repositories across the country. These included personal papers, personnel files, correspondence, lecture notes, other teaching material, histories of departmental records of department meetings. Then, of course, there's the sort of sources, the other primary sources, which were the written texts and things that were written by these women teachers and thinkers on international relations. So books, academic journals, but also a kind of wide array of genres of thinking about international relations. So newspaper articles, book reviews, teaching materials, and internal university memoranda, radio addresses, obituaries, all the kind memoirs, some autobiographical writing as well, which was really helpful. And oral histories. So the Leverhulme project that I mentioned earlier, we created about 20 oral histories, interviewing emerita professor for their recollections and their memories as well, which were very helpful. And so from this and other material, it was possible to draw up a pretty good picture of the gendered history of IR. Of course, it's not entirely a history without men. And I looked at their papers of many of the important male interlocutors and colleagues of the women protagonists in the book.
I want to get back to the I guess the mechanisms of this erasure, and I'm curious about the institutional dynamics of this. And you already mentioned the role of banning gatekeeping things in LSE, but it is precisely in this period that you start to see the emergence of an institutionality that started to regulate the field, right? So the Chatham House is also part of this, and well, you mentioned already some of the rest. So how should we think about that, right? So the institutionality that emerged in this period and the specific features of it in the UK. This is something that was in the back of my head when I was reading the book, like how similar this could have been to the story in the US, where, as you mentioned, IR from the very beginning was sort of embedded in political science departments. Help me navigating that. Help me trying to understand how this was happening in the context of organizations that had a certain type of rules and codes and so on.
Yeah. So I mean, there's important differences between the US and British context, and I think that they still matter today, right? So I think IR in Britain is much more intellectually plural and often always has been, compared to IR as an American political science. So yes, but it was built as a standalone field in the US. In Britain, and it's a much smaller national context. So this concentrated power in a few posts and in some particular venues, and so that made the boundary drawing easier and the women in some sense easier to exclude from the 1950s. Again, I have already spoken about the Manning example. And he kind of wrote out of the history of the International Studies Department at LSE, Lucy Philip Mayer, who, taught, many students, in the main center of international relations teaching in the country for many, many years. And he sort of, again, defines out her, and again, I mentioned already his important sort of other. His constitutive other was, of course, Agnes Sedler-Morley, a diplomatic historian. At Chatham House, which is really actually where the scientific study of IR was consolidated in Britain. It wasn't in the universities, it was at Chatham House. And Chatham House always had a role and was a kind of very important convening role in the British Committee for the Study of International Relations as well. It's a more interesting story because, at Chatham House, Margaret Cleave was from the early 1920s through to 1950s when she retired, was the head of the Information Services Department at Chatham House. And she really oversaw every basic activity for which Chatham House became famous, the journals, the press cuttings, the many conferences. And so unlike the LSE and the British Committee, and she hired lots and lots of women to run Chatham House. So people who were there really sort of talk about how it was really dominated by like large numbers of women who sort of were there at Chatham House and described it a bit like a cat house. And I just talk about them doing sort of Chatham housework, who, they were providing the raw materials for the scientific study of international relations at this time, right? Press cuttings, they were the back room of Chatham House. But Chatham House also, then this was all overseen by sort of the big men who were the figureheads and in leadership positions. But Chatham House did fund many of the women international relations thinkers that I sort of discussed in the book. So Susan Strange and Elizabeth Wiskman and Coral Bell, Rachel Wall, they all Chatham House was really formative in their careers, partly through just sort of offering them research positions, funding them to work on the survey of international affairs. It was a sort of a quite mixed gendered field, much more so than in the Council for Foreign Relations in the United States, which had a bar on women. There was much more kind of, women were much more present at Chatham House, but there was still a kind of gender division of labor in the sense that the sort of big names and the big posts were held by a small number of men, but basically there were so many other women around them that it was a kind of interesting, it's sort of odd and interesting institution in terms of telling the kind of this sort of gendered history, but also of memorialization. So again, when Margaret Cleave retired, they, all of the bigwigs celebrated her contribution and said that she was basically second only to Lionel Curtis, who founded Chatham House, in terms of the influence on the institution. And then when she died about 10 or 15 years later, one of the women who worked in the press office suggested that they organize a sort of a Margaret Cleave Prize to honor her legacy. Because, after all, had she not been second only to Lionel Curtis in influencing Chatham House, and sort of then the men who were tasked with doing this basically said, oh no, actually she probably wasn't that important after all, and aren't these things just so much work and effort? And they basically couldn't be bothered to establish the Margaret Cleave Prize. Of course, now in 2022, when organizations are, honored and celebrated for, their equality, diversity, inclusion work, in that moment, in the early 2020s, they established a Margaret Cleave lecture to honor her. But, when it mattered, of course, the old patriarchy diminished her incredible intellectual labors, which really were foundational to Chatham House in its most important role, in this most important period, rather, when IR was consolidating as an academic science.
I would like now to bring the conversation to the present, and I have sort of two different questions in that regard. So one is related to what you from the very beginning describe as sense of failure in IR, at least of a certain type of intellectual project that a branch of IR represents. I guess I want to ask you to tell me more about what exactly you perceive as the failure. But you describe that sense of failure out there, and I'm curious about how much of that can be traced and connected to the erasure of this diverse foundations of the field, and then I'm I want to ask you about how you feel that the field is recognizing the contribution of, let's say, minorities or other voices that are that might not be receiving the attention that they probably should, right? And I guess with this we're connecting sort of the first question that I asked you. How far do you think that we have moved from your story? So again, I'm throwing a lot at you now, right? But how do you think that your story connects with IR now, and what are the challenges that the field is facing, and how profound are they?
Yeah, so there's been much talk about IR's failure as an intellectual project. I think it's both inside and outside the field. So critics have pointed out that, IR, it rarely exports its ideas and approaches. Other social scientists care very little, if anything at all. Certainly not humanities scholars either, for international relations scholarship, and certainly not for sort of IR theories, right? So the justification for the separation of IR, or the distinctiveness of IR, was always that it was sort of theory driven, and where are these theories now? In Erased, I argued that the sources of this failure in the British context were three interrelated ones, right? One was the marginalization of historical method. For me, this was sort of really hugely significant, and it sort of displaced historical archival inquiry, and now we sort of have very weak grasp and understanding of the significance of history. The second is the marginalization of studies of race and empire, and this is probably the key. Well, this is equally, if not more important and related. Mid-century IR, both in Britain and the United States, dropped imperialism and dropped empire, and therefore was unable to reckon with empire and its legacies. And I think that we are, when we think about international relations today, that is clearly a major feature. And finally, the whole book is about, in some sense, the related erasure of women intellectuals from the history of the field, and then women's intellectual labors that underpinned early IR, especially including on empire, anti-colonial organizing, non-Western powers. Women historians were thinking in these terms, and so it stripped IR of the sort of perspectives needed to grasp, worldwide plurality. And just thinking ahead then into the contemporary field, I think obviously the field is much more plural than it was, in the second half of the 20th century. Even in the last decade, I think it's especially visible in the International Studies Association. But many others have argued more powerfully than I have. I borrow other people's arguments. It's very clear that IR is still incredibly Eurocentric. The North Atlantic journals are the most important journals. The English sort of only norms that get about who gets heard, and this is quite problematic. And what we're still missing, of course, is scholars outside of the global North, work published in languages other than English. There's still so many problems with contemporary IR, and of course now we're facing. But now, in some sense, what we're going to be doing is kind of holding on to the small gains that we have made in the last 2 decades, perhaps, and against a growing far-right backlash, right? Against the universities, against academic freedom, against what we might think of as the equality, diversity, and inclusion agenda. And we're going to see, whether or not the American universities in the US context can hold the line. And in Britain, we're equally concerned about sort of. Our context is slightly different, where it's funding threats to funding, threats to entire university departments and universities that may collapse or be merged, and there's a sort of wider context of a kind of crisis of higher education in the context of a wider crisis of global order that we are witnessing today, where we have a sort of collapse of the fragile, albeit but nonetheless existing norms around civilian protection. Ideas about genocide and that never happening again, about we think about Gaza and we think about Ukraine, and we think about Trump, and it's quite bleak. And I'm not sure that IR is sort of best equipped, was as well equipped as it could have been to address these problems, given the story that I tell in Arrays. But of course, we're a new generation, and and it's the younger generation, I think, that will be teaching us how to think about what is happening now. And I'm not so, let's say, yes, rather than the sort of eminence, the kind of eminence Greece in the field now, but the younger generation, I think, who will lead the way.
Thanks a lot, Patricia. That's probably a great way of finishing this conversation, highlighting the importance of this story you tell that might seem something of the past. It's, if anything, pretty relevant for the challenges we're facing. So thanks a lot for writing the book. Thanks a lot for taking the time for this conversation.
Thanks so much, Javier. I've really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged, thank you, and take care.